Hey, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is Liz, joining you as usual from Central Virginia, the unceded lands of the Monacan Nation. I'm so glad that you're here. And in particular, I want to welcome you to the latest episode of the Interstitial. Interstitial is these podcasts that I'm recording in between interview episodes with people. And this particular episode reflects what's been present for me since my last two conversations. One of those was with Sophie Messager about reclaiming drumming and what that can mean for women, and then also Ash Stinson and her work with the realms of embodiment. So I'm going to reference those here. You can always go back and listen to them, but not necessary if you want to. I think you can follow along here because we're going to weave in some of what's been going on for me too, because what's been on my mind really lately is how do we as women become truly free when we are all operating within a framework that was designed without the participation or input of women. So this is something I've been kind of coming at in lots of different ways over the last several years. And it's also reflected in my current work and my exploration of what and how feminine wisdom can teach us about power in particular that we're not currently getting within this cultural paradigm that we're in and how it views power. So how do we get free? How do we get free? I see three distinct steps along the way here, and I want to talk about each of them in a little bit more depth. So the first one I'd say is some sort of awakening that opens us to the reality that whatever we're being fed by culture is not nourishing us in the way that we would hope or expect. And in my case, it was an external event, which I've written and spoken about a lot. This moment I had at a business conference that triggered a full-bodied awareness that there was so much more to this so-called reality than what I'd understood. And I don't think everyone needs to have that kind of dramatic moment. Honestly, I'm not even sure that it has to be catalyzed by some external event. But I do think this awakening is a big part of the process. And I think that's reflected, for example, in Sophie's experiences with patriarchal religions, or in Ash's awareness that her work as an architect and designing other people's homes could only be so effective if she and others didn't feel at home in their bodies, which is something we all inhabit our entire lives. So the first step in our liberation as women, I think, is this moment of awakening. And the second is what I would call a deep internal reckoning of what it's cost us to participate in systems that were not designed for our benefit in any way. And this could be a really painful part of the process because it can stir up a lot of emotions. It can stir up a lot of memories. I know in my own journey, I have cycled through grief, bitterness, a lot of rage, shame, even at some of the choices that were driven by the lack of awareness that I had, you name it. And I think there can also be a real tendency to vilify and blame here as well, because let's face it, everyone is participating in these structures along with you. So maybe that looks like anger towards family members or religions that were supposed to nourish and protect you but really didn't, then taught that you were lesser. Jobs and careers where you've seen yourself work harder than men, or, teachers that sent all kinds of messages. And I think all that anger and that frustration, it's really valid. I know for me, moving through those emotions has been a really important part of the process to get to the next stage. And when I say move, I'm not necessarily saying fast. In my case, I needed to let them fester for a while. And then I also, when I was ready, needed to literally get them out of me, sometimes through writing or speaking. And later I figured out movement was a really good way, like physical movement, dance was a really good way to move it. But there's a whole first draft of my book that never saw the light of day. And I now understand that I needed to write that draft in order to process everything that I was feeling, but readers didn't necessarily need to read it. The thing with this second step is that eventually, however long it takes, it's important to move through it. And doing that on your own timeline is super important. And certainly that's not to say that we're never annoyed and frustrated again, but maybe it's not so consuming because we processed the first time around. So I'll give you an example from my own life. Not long after I began learning about the sacred feminine, I couldn't not see all the ways that women had been subtly and not so subtly affected by her absence. And I was so pissed, honestly. Every time I saw a magazine in the grocery store celebrating how somebody lost their baby weight within 6 weeks, I would want to throw it across the store because I could see this bullshit, this pressure that we put on women to look a particular way. Or every movie that my now ex-husband wanted to watch after the kids went to bed seemed like it was some dumb action movie where women had no roles in making it and really no role in the movie itself except to get naked or support his dreams or maybe do both at the same time. And I had to make sure that my ex-husband knew how dumb I thought it was. I was mad at him for not being able to see these things. I was mad at my mom for participating in a religion that had no female perspective whatsoever, for making me participate in it as a kid, and for warning me that I was on a dangerous path now because she didn't understand it, which, by the way, we have moved far, far beyond that at this point. But I was mad, just mad, mad, mad about all of it. And you know what? Thank goddess I allowed myself to be in that space for as long as I needed to be. But what eventually emerged was this. If I continue to stay mad, in a way, I'm validating those perspectives in the first place. And what I mean by this is I'm disappointed in these situations. I'm disappointed in people. I'm disappointed in systems for not being what I needed. In that disappointment, there is some level of hoping that they will change to give me what I need. And in doing so, I'm still keeping them in power. I'm legitimizing that they deserve the power in the first place. And I'm assuming that they will continue holding the power and maybe recognize me and honor me. Does that make sense? I hope so. Y'all can tell me if it doesn't. But this leads me to the third step in becoming free, which is, if we set aside that need for someone or something else to address this, then we get to consciously choose how we want to move forward. So that's the third step. And I think this is where the work gets super interesting. In one of my earlier podcast episodes, I had a guest on named Letty Sullivan who talked about how important it is that we withdraw our consent from situations and people that are not serving us. And so I'll give you an example of that in the form of me fully disconnecting from the Southern Baptist religion that I was raised with. I chose to say, you know what? Any representation of God that doesn't include the feminine is incomplete to me. So I'm going to withdraw my consent mentally from that. And physically, I'm going to choose not to be in those spiritual spaces that don't offer me an understanding of the sacred and feminine form. I'm just not going to do it. And I'm not arguing with you or anybody else about my choice. I'm not asking you to change your mind, because if I do, I'm kind of legitimizing the perspective that maybe somehow I need you or someone else to agree with my choice. And I don't. I just get to say, not for me, and move on. And I have to tell you, this can be really exhilarating, but it can also be really hard too, because I think odds are high that there are a lot of people who aren't going to see things the same way as you anymore, right? I mean, you are the one who's changed. I was the one who changed. If I weave back in my most recent podcast, I think maybe good examples of this are when Sophie described drumming at a birth in a hospital for the first time and how she couldn't even meet the eye of the midwife initially because she just felt like, God, this is so weird and embarrassing. Or I think of how Ash described her process for really listening and asking the body what's happening. And I think she gave an example of, I've got this twinge in my foot. If I stay with it and I ask it to tell me more, maybe it points me towards this pain in my knee. And maybe in feeling the pain in my knee, I suddenly feel a moment of grief or a moment of anger or a moment of anxiety. And then imagine taking all that into your doctor and explaining that process and the looks that you might get in response. In my own life, I can think of the several months following my awakening experience at the business conference and how I couldn't see the business world or my own participation in it the same anymore, and how much I was at a loss for words to explain any of it. I just couldn't. I couldn't say what was happening to me. And so this is really where the rubber meets the road, because as we start to withdraw our consent from these systems, we get to choose how we're going to show up in the world instead. And I don't want to make that too weighty, right? The first thing I want to do is offer ourselves a lot of grace. And maybe I'm speaking from my own perspective, which is, when I realize the inequity of these systems, the first thing I do is I'm like, well, I got to get out of all of them. I got to get out of all of them, and I got to figure out how to change them. And if you were like me, I would say the first thing you need to do is offer yourself a lot of grace, because it's out of your individual control when and how these systems are going to change. You can withdraw your consent in many ways. You can work hard to change them in whatever ways work for you, but you can't control when they're going to die. and what might show up instead. There's just too many factors at play. So, what can you do right now is the question. Well, if I think back to these podcast episodes, you can choose to pick up the drum and play it. You can choose to share about that practice and what it means to you. You could seek out community if it exists, or you could create the community and just call like-minded people to you and have the courage to kind of be seen in doing that. You could really cultivate the practice of listening to your body. You could have the courage to take what it's saying to you seriously and then follow that guidance and ideally try to find a doctor who's going to listen to you too. In my case, I chose to leave the business world because I couldn't stomach the idea of participating in it the way I had in the past. And at the time, I couldn't see a different way to be. So that looks like a pretty extreme example of withdrawing my consent, right? But you know what? I was able to leave because I had a husband at the time that was making enough money that allowed me to do that. I was still participating in it. I was still part of it. I was withdrawing my consent in a way, but I was still a part of the system. And as a single mom, now I can tell you that I can rail against a capitalist system and how it treats people and nature as commodities and how it was never designed with the input of women. But you know what? I still got to be a part of it. I have to feed my kids and keep a roof over our heads. So I do participate in it, and I'm not going to feel bad about it. I contribute my part in the best ways that I can in the work that I do here. I try to show up the best as I can, and I keep going. And here's the last thing I'll say about this 3-step process to liberation and really choosing how we want to show up in the world. And it's that choosing, that conscious choosing that I want to come back to. And I always encourage women to ask ourselves some critical questions. And right now I am speaking to who I think the audience is here, which is mostly Western women who have probably some education and some perhaps experience in the business world, but you're part of this cultural paradigm here, which means in terms of the rest of the world, we actually have a lot more power than many other women. And so here are the critical questions. Am I waiting for permission to show up differently? Am I waiting for it to be super easy or comfortable to go against the grain? Do I have more power to change my life than I'm giving myself credit for? I do not know the answer to those questions. These are individual questions for individuals to answer. But what I do suspect is that for many of us, we have more freedom and power than we're giving ourselves credit for, even if it starts with a mindset shift. So choosing our path to liberation, while also acknowledging that, look, none of us are going to live in a female-led utopia tomorrow. It's rich, it's interesting, and it's worth our consideration. So if that speaks to you, maybe sit with it, maybe be with it, maybe wonder about that. And with that, that's our last episode of 2025. I am so grateful to all of you as we wrap up the 5th year of this podcast. So grateful to all of you, as always, for tuning in, for listening, for sharing your thoughts, giving me your recommendations on guests. I'll be back with you in 2026. And as always, take such good care of yourself. I'll be with you soon.